In a talk called The Three Holy Wars, author and historian Howard Zinn discussed how Americans refused to listen to criticism on certain wars, such as the American Revolution, World War II, and, most importantly for this video, the American Civil War. Now, the crux of Zinn's argument is that basically there is no such thing as a good war, and even a good outcome to a war, like the end of slavery, is not worth it. Now, there are issues with Zinn's argument here. Author and journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates, in a 2012 article for The Atlantic, criticized Zinn for taking his war is bad stance to the point where he is arguing that slavery in America should have been allowed to continue simply to avoid a war. Additionally, he pointed out how Zinn ignored attempts to resolve the crisis peacefully in the decades leading up to the Civil War, and last-ditch attempts by President Abraham Lincoln to do so that were rejected by the enslavers. However, during the talk, Zinn said the following: maybe there could have been slave rebellions, which hammered away at the southern slave structure, hammered away at them in a war of attrition, not a big bloody mass war, but a war of attrition and guerrilla warfare, and John Brown type raids. And this, my fellow alternate historian, got me thinking, could a slave revolt end slavery in America? Hello everyone, I'm Matt Mitrovich, the alternate historian. In this video, I'm discussing slave revolts in America and how they could have changed history. As usual, we start with the historical context. Despite what lost cause pseudo-historians and Twitter trolls cosplaying as Confederate generals might tell you, people didn't enjoy being slaves. Turns out doing backbreaking work your entire life for someone who might at any moment sell your children just to turn a quick buck is not exactly the American dream. Thus, slaves found ways to resist. Some worked as slowly as they could or pretended to be sick in order to get out of work. Of course, the enslavers found ways to keep slaves in line by using violent punishments such as whippings, mutilations, or branding. And since keeping a slave was a lot cheaper than paying a worker, and the slave trade meant replacements were always streaming into southern ports, death was always an option. With these conditions, it's no wonder that many slaves sought a permanent escape from slavery. For American slaves, this could mean fleeing to the Free States, Spanish Florida, or Canada. Slaves sometimes fled to British lines during the American Revolutionary War or the War of 1812. There were also mutinies aboard slave ships, such as the Amistad in 1839. And of course, there was outright rebellion. Now, it's hard to know how many slave rebellions there were in America, since record-keeping and historical research into them hasn't been great. As Britannica put it, in the United States, the myth of the contented slave was essential to the preservation of the South's peculiar institution, and the historical record of rebellions was frequently clouded by exaggeration, censorship, and distortion. This means enslavers preferred to pretend that slavery had a civilizing influence on slaves, which made them too docile to revolt, and any rebels were rare exceptions. The wealth and power enslavers wielded also meant that rebel slaves were portrayed in newspapers as criminals seeking only to loot, rape, or murder. Even after the enslavers were defeated in 1865, this white supremacist myth continued in order to portray African Americans as being too simple and lacking the imagination to be anything other than servants. Because how could you convince others that slavery is a good thing if men, women, and children were willing to die rather than be a slave for just one more day? The truth is, there were around 250 slave revolts, with 10 or more participants, from the earliest American colonies to the start of the American Civil War. In fact, the first recorded slave revolt in what would become the United States happened in 1526, when African slaves rebelled in a Spanish colony in what is today South Carolina. Other famous slave revolts include the 1811 German Coast Uprising, where close to 500 rebel slaves marched on New Orleans, burning plantations on the way before being stopped by a combined force of federal troops, local militia, and volunteers made up of the local plantation aristocracy. According to the Smithsonian Magazine, the goal of the rebellion was to establish a black state along the Mississippi River, which really would have made the West wild. And then there's the 1831 Nat Turner's Revolt, named after an enslaved black preacher who, after allegedly receiving visions from God, organized and led a slave rebellion in Virginia. While not as large as the German Coast Uprising, almost 60 white people were killed in the uprising and many black slaves were freed. Also, there were planned rebellions that were thwarted before they could kick off. Examples include Gabrielle's Rebellion of 1800 or Vesey's Rebellion of 1822. Allegedly, each would have involved thousands of rebel slaves. The participants in Vesey's rebellion planned to seize Charleston, South Carolina, while if Gabrielle's rebellion had been successful, it may have ended with the capture of Richmond, Virginia, and taking then-governor and future American president James Monroe hostage. There was even a planned flag for Gabrielle's rebellion, which would have had on it the words, "Death or Liberty," a deliberate reference to the famous line, "Give me liberty or give me death," made by American revolutionary Patrick Henry. Imagine seeing that flying over a Richmond captured by Americans fighting for their freedom. Of course, what color this flag would be is unknown, but as Stephen A. Knowlton pointed out in his 2013 paper, Contested Symbolism in the Flags of New World Slave Risings, the colors white, red, and black appeared the most frequently in the flags of slave revolts. Hence why I asked the always talented Sean McKnight to use the color red in order to make a fitting flag to fly over a free Richmond.
The kid's a natural.
If I'm being honest, however, none of these revolts accomplished their immediate goals of ending slavery or creating an independent black nation. There were various factors for why this happened. For example, if we look at Haiti, which was the only nation founded by a successful slave revolt, we see a place with a higher ratio of black slaves to white colonists. In America, however, that ratio was much lower, even in regions where African Americans were in the majority. And while in Haiti, any troops needed to put down the revolt had to be shipped over the Atlantic while the Napoleonic Wars were raging back in Europe, in America, slave revolts could be suppressed with state militia, local volunteers, and in rare instances, federal troops. Additionally, the number and types of weapons available to rebel slaves was limited. Hatchets, axes, knives, and various blunt instruments were a lot more common than guns, and what guns were available were single-shot muskets that took a long time to reload, especially if you didn't have the training to use them. Now, to be fair, some rebel slaves were veterans of conflicts in their homelands, but the experience of fighting in Africa probably didn't prepare you for facing an armed and disciplined infantry line that had been deployed against you. And once these revolts were put down, the swift and brutal retaliation by whites who feared another Haiti began. After being tried in a kangaroo court, rebel slaves were executed, sometimes by hanging, burning, or beheading, with the severed heads then mounted on poles in public places in order to intimidate the enslaved and free black populations. Often hundreds of slaves who did not rebel were killed in violent attacks by panicky whites. Laws were also passed limiting the ability of slaves or free blacks to freely move, assemble, learn to read or write, or even practice their religion without being observed by whites to make sure they followed a pro-slavery interpretation of the Christian Bible. And it makes a certain kind of sense this was done, since enslavers did not want educated slaves who believed in intangible things like freedom or liberty. They wanted someone who worked, produced children who could work, and did it all without complaining until they died. Now, to be fair, states sometimes did consider abolishing slavery after a slave revolt. Virginia actually considered doing this after Nat Turner's revolt. However, they obviously didn't do that, and abolitionism was never a popular position to hold in the slave states. In fact, enslavers blamed abolitionists for inciting slave revolts. In truth, however, most abolitionists, regardless of their race, never fully endorsed violence and even had mixed feelings about the Haitian Revolution. There were exceptions, most famously John Brown, whose 1859 raid on the arsenal at Harper's Ferry was meant to steal weapons to be used in a slave revolt. However, your average abolitionist sought non-violent solutions to ending slavery, such as spreading abolitionist literature or helping anti-slavery politicians get elected. And while I did say none of these revolts were successful in their stated goals, that doesn't mean they didn't contribute to the eventual ending of slavery in America. The revolts, the brutal backlash, and the great lengths enslavers went to suppress them nevertheless did inspire abolitionists to teach America about slavery's evils. One of these ways was 1st of August celebrations, which celebrated the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, and deliberately mimicked how 4th of July was celebrated in order to contrast the different standards of freedom in America. And as more people in the North embraced abolitionism, politicians began to take note, and a once radical idea suddenly became mainstream. And when the enslavers themselves rebelled, kicking off the American Civil War, almost 200,000 African American men took up arms to end slavery once and for all. But what if one major slave revolt, or a series of them, convinced America to end slavery without Lincoln, Fort Sumter, or Gettysburg? Before we get deeper into this alternate history, a quick disclaimer. By answering this particular what if, I'm not trying to imply African Americans were responsible for slavery lasting as long as it did. So I try to point out black resistance to slavery is a major reason why slavery ended in our timeline. Instead, I'm just looking at whether the American Civil War was inevitable, or if by tweaking certain factors, a slave revolt could have ended slavery in America instead. With that said, I do think a large slave revolt, or a series of revolts, could influence America enough to abolish slavery. There is some historical precedent to this idea when we look at how Britain abolished slavery. In our timeline, a slave revolt known as the Baptist War broke out in Jamaica from 1831 to 1832. Allegedly, up to 60,000 slaves participated, and while it was unsuccessful, the brutality shown by British colonials in punishing the rebels sparked outrage back in Britain, which eroded opposition to the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. So one possible point of divergence for this alternate timeline is Gabriel's rebellion not being discovered before it could kick off, and thus see the capture of Richmond. Or you could have the German Coast Uprising capture New Orleans. Interestingly enough, the 2019 reenactment of this revolt, which was organized by the artist Dred Scott, ended with the rebel reenactors capturing New Orleans. But yeah, while a slave revolt that managed to capture a major city might ultimately be crushed when federal troops, cannons, and ships arrive, it would be a lot harder to cover up or downplay as slave revolts were in our timeline. Thus, even though these alternate revolts didn't succeed, they can still inspire more rebellions. Granted, revolts, rebellions, and revolutions are bloody affairs. Much like in our own timeline, there will be violent reprisals by whites worried about repeating the violence of the Haitian Revolution. So while I don't blame anyone for laying low in order to protect themselves and their loved ones, that doesn't mean future revolts will be prevented. The problem with intense repression is that rather than destroy the will to resist, it only increases it. This is because people who feel they have nothing to lose tend to lash out, just like the Jews living in the Warsaw Ghetto did in 1943. And so, as the rebellions increase in size and frequency, the abolitionist movement might take a different path in response. Like I said before, most abolitionists wanted a non-violent end to slavery, but there were exceptions. As black abolitionist Henry Highland Garnett once said, "You had better all die. Die immediately, then live slaves and entail your wretchedness upon your posterity. If you would be free in this generation, here is your only hope. However much you and all of us may desire it, there is not much hope of redemption without the shedding of blood. If you must bleed, let it all come at once. Rather die freemen than live to be slaves." So in this alternate timeline, perhaps there are more Garnetts and Browns out there, not only encouraging slave revolts, but actively assisting in them. More abolitionists could buy guns or raid armories, and not just deliver them into the hands of rebel slaves, but also train them in how to use them. You may even find free blacks willing to go down south to do this. In our timeline, with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, many black communities formed armed militias to prevent slave catchers from taking Americans back into slavery. Thus, members of such groups could be used as advisors to aid slave revolts in the South. And while in a pitched battle the rebel slaves might be at a disadvantage, guerrilla combat is always an option. Rebel slaves and their militant abolitionist supporters may establish bases in the wilderness to launch strikes against nearby enslavers. For example, the Great Dismal Swamp in Virginia was once home to thousands of escaped slaves, and Nat Turner and his followers plan to ultimately escape there in our timeline. But in this alternate timeline, it could be a launchpad for raids to attack plantations and free more slaves. Thus, you don't need to have one massive revolt to end slavery like in Terry Bison's Fire on the Mountain. Instead, increasing the frequency of them could make the abolition of slavery much more plausible in this alternate America. As mentioned before, Virginia did consider ending slavery after Nat Turner's revolt, and they and other slave states might actually do this in this alternate timeline. They may even be encouraged to do so by the leaders of the Democratic Republicans and later the Democratic political parties. In our timeline, the southern slave states tend to be the center of these parties' political power. Thus, a series of ever-increasing slave revolts might cause people to lose faith in their ability to govern, and drive voters toward the Federalists, Whigs, and Republicans, thus encouraging an anti-slavery faction even among these early Democrats. This could also happen while the abolitionist movement is seeing a surge of support in the free states. You see, if federal troops are needed to put down or contain slave revolts, then free states may grow tired of sending their young men to die to defend slave plantations, and thus put increasing pressure on the federal government to end slavery. You may even find soldiers returning home after suppressing a slave revolt, and seeing firsthand the brutal retaliation by enslavers, decide to skip the next 4th of July celebration and attend the 1st of August celebration instead. Local politicians will take notice, and the pressure to end slavery increases. Granted, slave revolts also provoked racial violence in the free states, and this will still likely happen in this alternate history. However, I don't think this would necessarily prevent the public shift across the nation in supporting emancipation. So what happens to America after this alternate end to slavery? Well, we should remember that slavery would be abolished in America not out of any moral obligation, but out of fear of more revolts. Add that to the ideas of white supremacy that were used to justify slavery, and we likely get a post-slavery America that is similar to our own timeline, just minus Reconstruction. So you would have an American South where blacks were technically free, but still oppressed under a version of Jim Crow. How long this apartheid system would last is anyone's guess, but a civil rights movement could show up later, although one that might not benefit from the 14th and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution. These amendments came out of the American Civil War, and their guarantees of due process, equal protection, and the right to vote regardless of race were important legal foundations for the civil rights movement. But whether they will be passed in this alternate timeline, I'm not so sure. Alternatively, we may see worse futures for this alternate America. In our timeline, many Southerners oppose emancipation out of fear it would cause a race war. While these fears were unfounded, in an alternate timeline where there were larger and more frequent slave revolts, these fears could still be seen as reasonable to the former enslavers. Thus, we could see attempts to move the former slaves elsewhere, such as Liberia, which in our timeline was established as a home for former American slaves, or to the Western territories, similar to how Native American nations were forcibly moved westward to make room for white settlers. It's hard to know for sure what America would evolve into in this alternate history, but there is one thing I realized when making this video. I began this video by sharing Zinn's thoughts on the American Civil War, and while I guess I can agree with the general idea that war is bad, I don't agree that it should be avoided at all costs, even if it means allowing slavery to last longer in America. I think slavery likely would end with a war, because people willing to die rather than be a slave for one more day rarely, if ever, cause the enslavers to pause a moment from putting severed heads on poles to ask, "Are we the baddies?" Instead, they lied about the good of slavery and stated it would end on its own accord, while violently lashing out against those who disagreed. You can quote criticisms of slavery some Southern politician wrote in their journal, or aborted, half-hearted attempts to end it. But it still took a war to end it. In this alternate history, I imagine, there was still a war. Just one where most of the fighting to end it was the responsibility of African Americans. So while Zinn is probably right that slavery in America could have ended after larger and more frequent slave revolts, it certainly seems like he's implying this would have been a better outcome for America if less white people had to fight and die. In my humble opinion, it's better that Americans, regardless of race, unite to defeat evil institutions, like slavery, rather than allow injustice to continue for any longer than it did. Well, that's all I have to say on the subject. If you enjoy what I do, please like, comment, subscribe, share this video, support me on Patreon. I'm Matt Mitrovich, the Alternate Historian. Bye.